In this episode of the Church Security Roll Call, we're going to be discussing the Wedgwood Baptist Church shooting in Fort Worth, Texas. Stay tuned. Hi, this is Chris with Sheepdog Church Security, and this is your Church Security Roll Call. Today we're going to be discussing the article 1999 Wedgwood Baptist Church Shooting, Fort Worth, Texas. If you'd like to read that article, go to our website, sheepdogchurchsecurity.net, and look under the News tab. So we're starting something new here, and what we're going to be doing at first once a month is we're going to start profiling high-profile shootings at churches around the country. Now, the goal here primarily is to review what occurred and then try to draw from it some lessons learned, some things that we can do now in our own churches to either stop this type of thing from happening at our church or by at least mitigating the damage, the casualties, for our own safety, right? For our own churches. So a couple disclaimers here is first, we will never name the name of the killer. And the reason we do that is because we don't want to give that person any fame. And more importantly, we don't want to inspire anybody else to commit this kind of crime in the hopes of getting their name out there, to be recognized, to be remembered, because people are wired that way. I think about how suicide has changed over the years, and part of these activities are all about going out in a blaze of glory and leaving a name so people will at least remember you for a short time after you've killed yourself. Also, too, it's about sharing the pain. It's about, all these other families are now mourning because of this person's problem. The other thing is this is not about saying anything bad about the victims. The way I look at it is we actually honor the victims by learning from what they went through. And so if I ever say anything about they woulda, shoulda, coulda done this, it's not about necessarily Monday morning quarterbacking them and saying they're dumb and they made mistakes. It's not about that. It's about you and I learning from the situation. So let's get into this one. So this was a while ago. So this is 1999. So I guess, that's 21 years away. So it's been a while. So to give you kind of a little background, what was happening here is the high school students were planning on attending a See You at the Pole event. So I don't even know if they do those anymore, but basically the idea is that Christian students get together, they meet at the school, and they go, at the flagpole, and they pray for their, pray for their school, they pray for their fellow students, they pray for whatever, the country, whatnot. And so this was supposed to occur on September 16th, and it was a Thursday. So what they decided to do is that they were going to have a Wednesday night kind of rally. They were going to get all the students together, the pastors, youth pastors, that kind of deal. They brought in a band, they had refreshments, all that kind of stuff. And it was all meant to kind of motivate and, get the kids excited about the next day. Well, what occurred was so that started about 6 p.m. in the evening. The shooting occurred almost an hour later. And what happened is a middle-aged man dressed in a t-shirt, jeans, a black windbreaker, came into the church, into the lobby, and he had a cigarette in his mouth, 2 pistols, some extra ammunition, and a pipe bomb. And we'll get to those in a minute. Well, as he walked into the lobby, there was just a few people in the lobby. They had the associate pastor in the lobby. They had one of the Christian choir leader, whatever, group guy. He was sitting on a couch. And there was one other adult that was standing at a table that they're selling CDs of this Christian, rock band. And so the associate pastor approached him and asked him to put out the cigarette. And he pulled out a gun and shot the associate pastor. He then shot the person sitting on the couch, the choir director, and he shot the other adult that was standing behind the CD table. He then went into the sanctuary, and he actually pounded on the door. So he's not outside. He enters in, but he's, making a racket by hitting the door really hard. And I want to make sure that I get these words right here. He said, let's see, I can't believe you believe all this junk. And pointing at his handgun, he said, this is real. And that's when he started shooting with one of the handguns. And he basically shot a couple of people. He took a pipe bomb. He threw it down an aisle. It exploded. Nobody got hurt from the pipe bomb, thank God. And then he started shooting with his other guns. He actually took the time several times to reload and just keep shooting at people. There are, some reports that somebody had actually said to him, hey, you don't need to be doing this. And they were trying to tell him about Jesus. Well, that only made him angrier. And so he's starting to yell and cuss and, really getting, just crazy and continuing to shoot people. And then finally, after 10 minutes, think about this, 10 minutes, he finally sits back in a pew and towards the back, and he shoots himself. And so once all this is done, this whole event that lasted about 10 minutes, he had 6 people died, plus him, so you could say 7. And then you had another, what would be the math here? So that's 7, another 7 people that were injured. And so that's that's a pretty high body count, 50% dead, the other ones in the hospital. And so, it was a pretty horrible reason. So after this had all occurred, what they tried to do is they tried to figure out, what's his motivation here? Obviously he's dead, so we're not interviewing him. The other thing is he didn't leave any sort of notes, like a suicide note or anything to that effect. So they had to kind of figure out what motivated this guy. And so some of the things that kind of came up was, first, when he was younger, he was, according to in his words from, journals and things that they found, he was quite resentful about the fact that he was forced to go to church on a regular basis. Apparently he would go 3 times a week, and each time he just absolutely hated it and kind of had that anti-Christian attitude. They found other stuff like anti-religious materials and journal entries in his house afterwards. So there was kind of that. There was a clue that he had a serious problem with the church, from something maybe in his past. Other than that, he wasn't connected to that church at all. He didn't know anyone at Wedgwood Baptist Church. He never attended there. None of that. It seemed almost completely random. The next thing is there was some signs of drug use, possible drug use. Now, at the time of the autopsy, there was no drugs in his system, but he had actually spent some time in the Navy and was actually kicked out of the Navy for using marijuana. And so there's a little bit of a hint there that he had used, so long-term use of marijuana can actually cause serious problems. And there's been a number of those studies, and they always talk about extensive, intense use of marijuana. So in a sense, there's a chance at least that he kind of baked his brain. And people that do that, now, like I said, this is extensive use of marijuana, so long-term, and the amount can actually create mental disorders that include paranoia. And so that could be a factor that played into it, is old drug use type stuff. The next thing was mental illness, and there was a lot of signs to show that mental illness was probably the primary factor here. So, you had mental illness plus the additional damage of extensive, intense marijuana use. You can see what he did to his brain, or what was going on in his brain. When they went into his house, it was completely a mess, to say the least. It was just destroyed. And so there was things like just complete filth, garbage, biohazard type stuff. But there was also signs of he would go into a rage occasionally and just destroy things. So there was family photos that had been ripped up and thrown around, holes punched in the wall. He poured cement into the toilet, so something clearly is not right here. His neighbors, described him as really bizarre. And they said it actually, people that had been around him for a long time said it actually got a lot worse when his mother died almost 10 years earlier. And so he just kind of completely went off the rails. He was still living in that home with his father, who was actually financially supporting him. And there was evidence and some reports, at least the neighbors said, that he would verbally and physically abuse his father. The sad part is this, is nobody ever called the police on him for these things. And so it was all these unreported abuse, elder abuse, quite frankly, against his father. So also another thing is this, is just prior to the shooting, his father died like 3 months ahead of time. So he basically, so far we have an anti-religious idea, resentment from being forced to go to church. We have extensive, intense marijuana use, plus the mental illness. He's also displaying violence, known violence against his father, So we're starting to see how all that profile's kind of coming together. Even though it doesn't necessarily say it directly in the research, we're probably talking about somebody who's also a loner, right? I mean, how many friends do you have when your mental illness has you pouring concrete into your toilet, right? His neighbors called him bizarre, crazy, wild, weird, all that kind of stuff. And so we have some other issues. We also have other signs of mental illness. He couldn't really hold down a job, but he would make really bizarre claims about his fellow employees, that they were somehow oppressing him and all kinds of stuff. He made reports to the local news station where he said that the police wanted to charge him with being a serial killer and that he was being subjected to psychological warfare. So you really start, you can kind of see this is really what's going on in this guy's head, which is not normal at all. The final thing that kind of adds into all this is they were able to find out that he had some connections to some extreme hate groups. And these hate groups were typically anti-Semitic, so anti-Jewish, and they were also anti-Christian. And they think one of the reasons he went to the Baptist church is because the Southern Baptist Church had more recently come out as supporting and loving the Jewish people. And it was about converting them and bringing them to Christ, but it was a commitment to be, I guess, like I said, supportive of the Jewish community. And so here you go with his hate groups that were anti-Semitic, his hate group connection to the Klan, anti-Christian, and those things coming together and really making Southern Baptist churches, in this case, Wedgwood Baptist Church, the target to be hit. So after all the shooting, or I should say during the shooting, I'm kind of go back here a little bit and talk about response, the short-term response, what happened there, and then what happened later. Is the first thing that happened is this, is during the attack, most people's reaction were thinking that this was some sort of skit. And they think that's one of the reasons he actually felt like he had to pause and say a couple times, this is real, because people are looking at him as if it's a play or something and don't understand that actual people are being killed. And then once they did figure it out, people are running and diving for cover and trying to get out of the area. But he was still, think about this, this happened for 10 minutes. So how many people weren't running for cover, not looking for their advantage to get away? In a calm situation, you can probably evacuate your church for a fire drill in, 5 to 6 minutes. This went on for 10 minutes. It was the neighbors that ultimately called 911. So there was not even a plan, or it did not occur to anybody in the situation to even call 911. And so when the police finally gets there, he's dead. And so, he's neutralized. They discover the pipe bomb, that a pipe bomb had been used. So they evacuate the entire church and they have to do a search. Meanwhile, people are still on the floor, dead and or possibly dying. Now, there's no research that proves that people were still alive when the police got there, but could have immediate action possibly helped? Maybe. Who knows? We'll never know that. And I don't want to put any whatever on the police. They probably knew that they were dead or believed they were dead with a pretty good amount of authority there. But anyway, so they cleared the whole thing. Now, soon after, church members and volunteers actually were the ones that ended up coming back the next day to clean the place up. And we've talked about this in the past. Part of our active shooter or violent intruder training has to include a plan to get people in there to make repairs and to clean the place. And you know who it shouldn't be? The victims that were there. So sometimes you need to bring professionals in, especially crime scene professionals that come in and clean up that kind of mess. But they had to come in. It was their own volunteers to come in and clean the place up. They did have a memorial service for all the victims, but they had no plan for counseling and therapy for the survivors. That was completely unavailable in 1999. That's not entirely shocking that there wasn't that kind of plan put together. There's a report that at least one student went to school the next day. So they see all this stuff and it doesn't really even occur to anybody of what to do, that aftercare from such a traumatic event. But in the end, the congregation did pull together. They stayed strong and they, stumbled through the response. So long term, in the end, the church was completely unprepared, and they identified that. And so for about and just for clarity, this was just 5 months after the Columbine High School shooting. And so they're completely unprepared despite that warning, probably in their mind making, well, that's just something that happened at the school. It would never happen to us. There's no expectation of any kind of shooting at a church really that way. While there has been violence in church prior to that, it was either low profile, one-off type stuff, or, it was pretty rare. What they did do, though, in the long term is they had a veteran from the police department, and they put together a real plan to start preparing themselves for these types of incidents with, of course, the goal of primarily to save lives. So there's a lot of lessons learned in this, and I'm sure you can think of a lot. One of the things that I just think about is if you're listening to this podcast or watching me on YouTube, you're probably already 100% convinced of just how important it is to have some sort of safety ministry. I mean, even if it's just a bunch of people with cell phones that are just paying attention, you're already a little bit better off. I think about when the bad guy came into the church. If there would have been a greeter there or a safety team member there that had been trained in situational awareness, they probably would have seen his demeanor, right? The anger on his face, the tenseness of his body, other indications that something was completely wrong. Clearly smoking a cigarette is something that you don't often see inside a church. That's a rare thing. The other thing is verbal de-escalation. So, it's easy. Once again, it's easy to hindsight is 20/20. But you see an angry person that clearly doesn't belong there, and they have a cigarette in their mouth. Do you address the anger, their demeanor, or do you address the cigarette? I would say you address the larger of the two problems. As far as I'm concerned, an angry person can smoke a cigarette in the lobby all day long as I'm able to address that anger and try to use verbal de-escalation techniques to keep them calm and talking to me. Now, there's no proof that this would have worked. I'm just throwing it out there as something. You see an angry person, they're smoking a cigarette in the lobby. Do you go up and say, hey, put out the cigarette? Or do you say, hey, I can see that you're angry, that you're upset. Is there any way I can help you? Is there anything I can do for you? And that might have delayed him. That might have stopped him. That might have maybe change nothing at all. But something for us to think about. We have to have a team that's trained to spot these little warning signs. The other thing is this. Certainly when the person comes in, we talk about our different levels of awareness, right? So level white, you're completely turned off. This is you sitting in your recliner at home watching TV. That's good. That's fine as long as you're at home. As soon as you walk out and you start working, as part of the safety team at the church or really just out in public anywhere, you need to be an elevated level to yellow, right? So this is your calm awareness. This is where you're not worried about nothing, but you're just kind of paying attention and, you're looking for anything that might occur. Then once you start to identify that something might be up, like an angry guy with a cigarette, now you're at that level orange, right? So at the level orange, for us in a safety team, this is, if nothing else, is the time we're getting on the radio, letting our partners know that we are going to need backup in the lobby. There's something suspicious going on here. Start heading this way. So we would use that as a suspicious person. We might even use code orange as a potentially violent person. And so I would have been on the radio, hey, code orange, lobby, 911, possibly. It would at least be code orange in the lobby. And then my team members know to start heading that way because something could be occurring. And then, of course, at that time he shot me, if I'm the first guy talking to him, then at least you're coming to back me up. My team's coming to back me up. And he could have maybe been neutralized at that point. So something else to think about. That situational awareness training that your team gets, maybe your door greeters get that, maybe your ushers get that, to prepare them to look for these kind of things and then what to do when they do see those things. I mean, it could have been, hey, this is way above my thing. We need to go into a lockdown, right? Or if somebody in that lobby or in that area heard the gunfire, grab on the radio, lockdown. And whatever your plan is, you're applying that, right? So in the case of run, hide, fight, this is clearly a situation where no one was prepared for run, hide, fight. Now, this is probably before run, hide, fight. So you had Columbine that kind of birthed that just 5 months earlier. And so, but still, for us, this means run, hide, fight. And we have to train that to our people, our congregation. Now, the good news is this, is since about 2000, maybe a little bit, somewhere around that time frame, our kids have been trained in this. They've been trained in lockdowns in schools for now 20 years. Okay, so anyone under 20 years old, very, very likely, has been at least trained in going into some sort of lockdown. And run, hide, fight, which is kind of something that's come, since then, that's being taught too. Usually the people with the hang-ups for the whole run, hide, fight or any sort of lockdown training is the older people, because we never had to think about those things and we're so horrified by the very idea, and we should be, that we just feel like we're going to scare our kids or we're going to scare people out of the church, and it's not that at all. They get that. Moms and dads with kids in school right now know their kids are being taught how to go into a lockdown. Know that stuff. So us older people, we just have to get over that and just talk about the importance of it. All right. So it really comes down to the whole training into spotting suspicious behaviors, having a team who's trained in spotting suspicious behaviors, and then have some sort of response plan to that. Now, in the article, Wesley has some things in there about, just some basics of things you should look at, like things like, excessively loose clothing, or, heavy clothing when it's hot out. Do they keep their hands in their pocket? Are they printing in anywhere where you could see like the shape of a gun? Are they cupping their hands like they're holding something? A lot of people that carry concealed, even especially new concealed carry people, they do a lot of gun checks to make sure their shirt or whatever is pulled over their weapon. And it's kind of funny. Go to church, stand in the back row, and just watch people for gun checks, and you'll know very quickly, or at least you'll know some of the people that are carrying concealed. bulges in clothing, bags, cases, all those kind of things that people might store weapons and supplies and extra ammo and all that good stuff. So that's kind of my takeaway of lessons learned. I would really encourage you, to maybe share this video or this podcast with people in your team and get together and think about it. Maybe go to the website and pull up the article, read it together, and have a discussion in your team. I'm sure that some of you are going to come away with different lessons learned, maybe even better lessons learned. But this is what it's all about. Let's get into these materials. Let's review them, and let's figure out if we're prepared and what we would do. From what can we do to stop it from occurring? What would we do when it did occur? And then what would our recovery plan be? Do we have a plan to get people care and help afterwards? And my guess is a lot of churches out there, probably the vast majority, have none of that put together. And so this is the start to get that conversation going. So before I let you go, I do want you to know we do have an active shooter response course. And it's the whole intent of it is for basically the team. Primarily, I always focus on the safety team practitioners, if you will. But it's it's violent intruder response to help you develop different strategies and to help you mitigate casualties. And the sections that we cover in there is, why do churches need it? Civilian response plan, was the congregation or most people going to do? Active shooter preparedness, what we can do on the front end, some preventive stuff. And then finally, what the safety team's response plan can be. And so I really encourage you to check that out. If you haven't been through that training before, I think you're missing out on something that's going to be very helpful to you. So thank you so much for joining us this week. And hey, let's be careful out there. This program is made for informational purposes only and should not be taken as legal advice.